This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October the 14th, the Museum of the Institute hosted a virtual launch of Canadian War Museum historian Tim Cook's latest book, The Fight for History. Dr. Cook was introduced by museum curator Ryan Goldsworthy.
First of all, good afternoon to everyone and welcome to our RCMI webinar. My name is Ryan Goldsworthy. I'm the museum curator of the RCMI, and I'm joined by a member of the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion here to my right. We got a couple of uniforms on display. As well, we have an other ranks 7th Battalion sniper's jacket with wearing a Brody. So we thought we'd have a nice thematic approach. I'm actually streaming here today from the RCMI medals room. So great location, and we're happy to get going. So today I'll be hosting Dr. Tim Cook of the Canadian War Museum, who will be speaking on the launch of his new book, The Fight for History, 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War. So you may recall that we had originally planned to host Tim and his book launch back in the spring, but these plans were obviously and unfortunately derailed due to the ongoing pandemic. We were pleased to have revived this book launch, and we thank Tim for his availability and his support. In terms of the questions you may have for Tim, I have collected several of these questions in advance, but I would ask for anyone who does have a question, you can actually submit it via text in the chat option of the webinar platform, and I'll gather them for the end and I'll ask them to Tim at the end on your behalf. So before I introduce Tim for his part, I also wanted to say just a few words on our excellent museum and our upcoming museum developments. So the Museum of the RCMI, of course, is one of the oldest and largest military history museums in Canada. We manage a collection of over 11,000 artifacts, 6 floors of display space. We also possess one of the largest private libraries of military history in Canada. In fact, I think it's the largest, which has been an excellent resource for educators, students, and anyone of interest. So throughout our 130-year history, many of Canada's most notable veterans, servicewomen and women, public and private leadership, including every Governor General since 1890, have been closely affiliated with the RCMI. Among many veterans to have held membership here have been included every single Canadian Victoria Cross winner all the way back to the Boer War. Our museum collection has benefited from our members of the Institute and their families, of course, many of which who have donated their donations of their families' relics, their artifacts, personal effects throughout the last 100 years, which has led us to become one of the biggest and most prestigious military museums in Canada. So lastly, I'm looking ahead. We have had a couple of museum items to promote for your interest. So in December, we will be unveiling our new permanent First World War gallery at the RCMI on the 3rd floor. So this new and exciting exhibition will feature some incredibly rare and exquisite artifacts which have never before been on display. Many of the artifacts which will be featured in this upcoming exhibition were acquired from the J. Victor Taboyka collection over the past 3 years. We thank Mr. Taboyka for his many donations to us. The exhibition unveiling will actually be live streamed for free in December, so there's more details to come for anyone who would like to see it. This is the new era we're working with, and we're happy to still share our events, our collections, and whatever we can virtually. So this brings me to The Fight for History. As Tim writes, the book examines how Canadians have framed and reframed its Second World War experience over time. Tim contends that the Second World War's relevance to Canada has diminished much more rapidly than that of the First World War. He highlights the strange reality in that by the end of the 20th century, Canada's Second World War was more commonly depicted and remembered, including by historians, as a series of disasters. So we're focusing more on events such as the fall of Hong Kong or the Dieppe Raid of 1942. Our many victories and contributions to the ultimate Allied victory, from the Battle of the Atlantic to Normandy, Italy, Holland, to the Commonwealth Allied Training Plan, to even becoming the largest provider of allied foodstuffs and other logistical supports, have not been rightly or roundly remembered and championed. Tim aims to craft a more balanced view of this narrative and of the totality of Canada's experience in the Second World War. Tim, who is a national best-selling author and a premier military historian, has received many awards for his writing, including the J.W. Defoe Prize and the Charles Taylor Prize for Literary Nonfiction. For his contributions to Canadian history, he was named a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the Order of Canada. At this time, I will now pass it over to Tim. Tim, go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that. And thank you for coming digitally or virtually, I guess. It's always a great pleasure to be back at the RCMI. I appreciate Ryan bringing out the artifacts behind him. He always does that, and I love to visit and to speak, and it is an astonishing collection, rich in rare artifacts and stories, and really a treasure for all of Canada. Yeah, so one of my great pleasures is when I write these books is to be able to speak to audiences like yourself. This is going to be a bit of a one-way conversation, but I do hope that you take advantage of what Ryan said and to pose some questions. I love hearing the comments. Some of you know I've been doing this for about 25 years. I love talking to the families of veterans. I've spoken to veterans for a good portion of that time. And these are the stories that infuse my own work and I think help to remind me of why I do this. Writing books is not an easy thing. It takes an enormous amount of time, but I believe it's important. And this book, The Fight for History, is a book about history. It's a book about the writing of history and the telling of our stories. And titles matter. I thought about this one for a long time, but I saw this story as a battle. I see it as a fight for history. And I'm going to come back to that and talk more about that and hopefully hear from you as well. The evolving memory of Canada's Second World War, as Ryan just alluded to, has been a contested space. It's often been a struggle between different groups over the interpretation of the past. And it's also been a battle or a fight against forgetting. And so it's a book very much about history and memory and the stories we tell and the place of veterans in Canadian history. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book, the backstory around the book, and then give you a bit of insight into the book itself. The book is the third volume in my trilogy on Canada and the Second World War. The first book you can see there, The Necessary War, came out in 2014, and The Fight to the Finish came out in 2015. Some of you will remember that I wrote a 2-volume history on the Great War at the Sharp End and Shock Troops. And when I finished those books, back-to-back books, about 600 pages each, I said never again. I was never going to write 2 books back-to-back. But I forgot that promise and I was moving forward, and I wanted to do something to talk about the memory of the Second World War as we approach the 75th anniversary. And I think, as you know, we're in the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Anniversaries matter. They have a way of focusing the media. They have a way of focusing us as Canadians. They allow us to reflect upon and perhaps to bear witness to service and sacrifice. And I wanted to write the story, because I think until quite recently, Canada and Canadians had done a very poor job in telling our story of the Second World War. Now, that doesn't mean all Canadians, and I suspect you as a group are a particular group that is well attuned to the incredible contributions of Canada during the war. But I think it would be fair to say, 75 years later, that we have largely forgotten what we did from 1939 to 1945. And what I found in writing this book, quite surprisingly, is that we rapidly forgot our contributions only a few years after the end of the war. And that I found very strange, and I wanted to explore that. And so that's really part of the story that I'm telling here. I uncovered all kinds of new stories, and I've been able to hear back from professional historians who have said to me, wow, these are incredible new stories you're telling here. What did Canadians think about the Second World War in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s? As you'll see, and as many of you lived through it, I know it was a very dark period where we didn't talk about our military history. And that's even more surprising when you think that 1.1 million Canadians served in uniform during the war. That's from a country of 11 million, so about 1 in 10 Canadians. At least 3 million Canadians were involved in war work on the home front. Together, they contributed to the Allied fight against fascism and ultimately that hard-fought victory, a victory where Canadians defended Canada and Britain, and where they fought around the world in the Far East, where we fought in the Mediterranean, through Sicily and Italy, the Battle of the Atlantic, the various air campaigns, D-Day, the Normandy battles, the clearing of the Channel ports, perhaps one of the most important campaigns that most Canadians have never heard of, the Scheldt campaign, absolutely crucial to Allied victory, the Rhineland battles, and finally the liberation of the Dutch. These are incredible stories of contribution on the oceans, in the air, on land, at home. Canada, one of its veterans said, was not a warlike nation, and yet we played an unbelievably important role in the defeat of Hitler's Germany. And he was right. And when I was writing those 2 volumes, I realized that, and it was initially going to be only a 1-volume history, but it became a 2 volumes, and I'd been thinking about the legacy of the war since I published those books. Now, those books were bestsellers, they won national awards, and yet as I traveled across the country, and in fact, even when I was at the RCMI speaking about those books, one of the most common things I heard, well, 2 things I heard from people. One was thank you. Thank you for telling me about Canada's role in the war. They had grown up, like I had grown up, reading books about World War II, but they were books about the Americans or the British or the Germans. I had seen the television shows and the movies, and yet again, they were about the Americans, the Germans, the British, the Japanese, others. I read comic books, I played with toys, but again, they didn't talk about the Canadian experience. They were the German experience or the British experience or the American experience. There was very little about Canada. And as I was touring the country and talking to Canadians, I realized that, where people said, I'd never read about Canada and the Second World War before. Thank you. The other thing that I found odd was why we hadn't done a good job in telling our story. I'm a historian, I'm a former archivist, I'm a museum curator. I'm interested in memory. I'm interested in what we remember and what we forget, what we celebrate and what we allow to be cast away. And I thought it was very strange that we didn't do a better job in this country in talking about the Second World War. Now, I explored some of these concepts in a previous book, Vimy, The Battle and the Legend. And of course, Vimy plays a key role in our history. I reflected, and I was lucky to be at Vimy for the 100th anniversary. Perhaps some of you were there in 2017. More than 25,000 Canadians returned to Vimy. It was an epic event. It was astonishing to be a part of that. It was unprecedented. When was the last time 25,000 Canadians traveled thousands of kilometers to gather in a foreign country to mark a historical event? That is what occurred there. Vimy was and remains an important martial symbol for Canadians, an important legend that we use to tell our story. And I explored the story of Vimy in that book, Vimy, which is on our $20 bill, which is in our passports. There are hats that read the birth of the nation. And yet, again, why did we not talk about that way, talk about using those words and phrases about the Second World War. And in fact, as Ryan alluded to, when we talked about the Second World War, what we often focused on was defeat. We were and remain, I think, fascinated by Dieppe, perhaps haunted by it. But few Canadians know about the Italian campaign, where 100,000 Canadians served, or the Scheldt, which was absolutely crucial in opening up the logistical ports for Eisenhower's armies. The battles of the Rhineland. Very, very few Canadians could tell you about these battles and campaigns that were crucial in the defeat of Nazi Germany. We know very little about the massive air war, our massive and critical contribution during the Battle of the Atlantic. The list goes on. And yet somehow we had allowed our story to wither away. Why, I wonder, did we not fight harder for our own history? And so that gives you a sense, I think, of where the book is and its many meanings. And those meanings have changed over time. And I will come back to that. The idea of the necessary war, as I called it in a previous book, still remains true for those who know the history. The problem is too many Canadians do not know the history. And the subtitle to the book is important too: 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War. So I'm going to talk a bit about the forgetting and the remembering, and then at the end, the remaking. But the book starts, after a brief introduction, by looking at the incredible contributions of Canada, as I've recounted, and how Canada emerged from 1945 battered and bruised with some 45,000 dead servicemen and servicewomen, and yet, of course, proud of its service. We were wealthy. And yet I've talked to veterans, I've interviewed veterans, I've interviewed their children, I've read letters and diaries and memoirs. One of the great fears in 1945, and perhaps some of you were alive at that time, was the fear of returning to the Depression years. Those locust years had devastated and scarred this generation. And that was a great fear in 1945, that Canada would emerge from the war and yet slip back into terrible depression with no jobs and all that had been fought for lost. Now, as some of you know, after the Great War, as about 550,000 veterans returned to society, Canada did not do a good job in welcoming back that generation. There wasn't a sense of paying them what was owed to them financially, or giving them the training. And really about the only thing those veterans received were land grants. It was largely regarded as a failure. And that generation, often whose sons and daughters served in the Second World War, they fought for their children, and they fought for the Veterans Charter. And the Liberal government of the day introduced a series of legislation and programs to aid the veterans to return to Canada. There was monetary payouts, there was training, over 50,000 Canadians went to university. You'll remember, of course, that only very wealthy minority of Canadians went to university before the Second World War. That changes with the war. There were loans for land purchases, for purchasing houses, businesses. The Veterans Charter is one of the most important series of legislations ever passed in this country, and it helped to transition Canada from the war years to the peace years. And of course, as those veterans returned home, the wounded were cared for, there were jobs in the booming economy, and the citizen soldiers, and of course, that term I use for those in the Army, the Navy, Air Force, and other services, they returned to their communities and they built up this country. And I think to understand the prosperity of Canada in the second half of the 20th century, you simply have to know that it came from the Second World War. When I and other scholars talk about the war as a change event, this is one of those primary considerations to think about the prosperous Canada that we live in, largely made during the Second World War. And the million veterans who returned, they married, they had babies. Maybe some of you are part of that baby boom generation. They moved forward. And I think that's important. We as a country were moving forward. Europe was in ruins. Most of the world was in absolute, dealing with absolute destruction and violence. There was a massive collapse of the European empires, a decolonization moment, the rise of the two superpowers with the Cold War. And yet Canada was relatively wealthy and prosperous. And we left behind the wars and the Depression of the early half of the 20th century, and we moved forward into a new period in our history. Now, how does that fit into this story? Well, I think it's crucial is that we were not thinking about the war. Even though there were 1 million veterans, even though you would add to them the 500,000 veterans from the First World War who were still alive, we didn't reflect upon the war. And I would argue we didn't do a very good job in telling our story almost from the start. Now, there were a number of interesting histories that came out in 1946 and 1947, largely written by journalists. They were national bestsellers. Canadians wanted their history. And yet we stopped telling Canadians about the history. We allowed the British and the Americans to write the story. And I'll just focus, I talk about this in the book in some detail, but I'll just give you 2 examples. You see on the screen here, Winston Churchill, the greatest historian of the 20th century in the English language. He has a wonderful quote that you may have heard, where he said, "History will look kindly upon me because I intend to write it." Well, he did, of course. His histories are majestic in scope and length, and very much about the British war effort. Our leader, however, was William Lyon Mackenzie King, and he did not write about the war except in his secret diary. And that is important. Our wartime prime minister did not write about the Canadian accomplishments. Neither did our senior generals. And you can see Harry Crear here in the color image. He was Canada's army commander in the last year of the war. And yet I suspect that not 1 in 1,000 Canadians could name him today. And that might be generous. Is it 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000? If we often think that Sir Arthur Currie is largely forgotten from the Great War, and we wonder if he was an American, if there would be Hollywood movies made about him, Harry Crear is completely unknown. And yet, it's not that generals were not writing their memoirs. Eisenhower wrote his. It propelled him to become president. Bradley, Montgomery, they were all best-selling histories, and they all laid down their version of history. And yet, we did not. And it wasn't just Crear. It was every Air Force or naval commander as well. It was only much later in our history where we began to receive a smattering of memoirs from generals, of which the best one is probably, I would say, General Burns. And yet even then we pale in comparison still to this day to almost every other combatant nation. And this was known at the time. I've been in Crear's archival papers at the National Archives. He had people writing to him saying, please write your memoirs. If you write your memoirs, the story of Canada and the Canadian Army will be propelled forward. Unfortunately, Crear was tired. He had served in both world wars. He also didn't believe it was the job of the soldier to write his memoirs, and he never did. And I would say as well, if we think of our politicians and our generals, our veterans also did not write the memoirs. Now, that was not as common then as it is perhaps now. And I think we have a better sense of the challenges of returned service personnel in writing their stories. There was also not a great market for Canadian memoirs, and yet there are so few of them from the first decade after the war. And one veteran, Pilot Officer Ron Laidlaw, the RCAF, he described the challenge. He was thinking about writing about his war experience, about wrestling that wartime experience down onto the page. And he wrote this: "For years, I've been trying to face up to this, but my mind is like a jigsaw puzzle, with many of the pieces either fuzzy or they won't fit into place or are lost. And as I now ponder how to handle this with the same shudder I have had for ensuing years, I find I'm able only to put swatches of scenes together, never the whole picture." Now, we do have a better understanding today of the challenges of mental wounds, of PTSD, and of veterans talking about their war experiences, but there was a silence after the war. And I will come back to that, except I will say that as I have traveled the country speaking to Canadians, perhaps the most common thing I have heard is from the children of veterans who say, "I wish I'd been able to ask my father or my uncle or my aunt about their wartime experiences. I wish I had known the questions. I wish they had been able to talk about their experiences." And I think that idea of silence is one that shrouds Canada's Second World War. And it would take about 35 to 40 years for these stories to begin to work their way out into the general public. And I'm not talking about a place like RCMI, where there is a place for veterans and for their families and those interested in the history. I'm talking about through schools and through general society. And I will come back to this. But I think, except for the official history written by Charles Stacey, and some of you may know my book, Cleo's Warriors, where I explored the writing of military history. And really, Charles Stacey was a giant in the field. But in 1948, the Navy and the Air Force, they canceled their official histories. And so it would take 40 years for those histories to emerge. And in one case, over 50 years for the naval history. All of this, I hope, paints a picture on the fact that Canada simply was moving forward and not interested in telling its story. And I'm going to come back to that because it continues on for decades. And as I was writing this history, I wondered, was it because of the death and destruction, the 45,000 killed? And of course it can't be. We had 66,000 killed during the Great War, and that has had a far greater presence in our history in the commemorative realm. And I wondered perhaps if there was something about the Great War that had obscured the Second World War. We, after the Great War, with our 66,000 fallen, I think, as you know, we built memorials across this country, in every city, every town, every village. I bet that wherever you are from, there is a memorial to the Great War. They're at the local, the community, the provincial, the national, with the Peace Tower and the National Memorial. We have the international memorials, Vimy and Beaumont Hamel. We have symbols like the poppy and John McCrae and Remembrance Day. That was a generation that struggled to make meaning of the war experience and built memorials and said, lest we forget, and we would never forget. We didn't do that for the Second World War. I wondered, for instance, why was there not a Vimy overseas? I mean, that's just shocking to me, why we didn't have a memorial overseas to talk about our service and sacrifice. And in that case, the government of the day and every day failed in its capacity to remind our allies of what we had done in the pursuit and the contribution to Allied victory. And so what did we do in Canada? Well, there was a great debate in 1945, and I talk about this in the book, because Canadians were talking about, should we build a new series of memorials to this generation? There's a fierce debate. And what Canadians decided on, overwhelmingly, was to create utilitarian memorials. And these would be used by local residents, and it was hoped that they would be active, vibrant places where the dead would be remembered as they had lived, animated, laughing as part of a community. And these utilitarian memorials were parks and playgrounds and skating rinks and libraries. And again, I suspect they're in your communities. So what happened to the names of the fallen? Well, they were typically added to the existing memorials, and you can see in some of these images here, it was not always an easy fit to add the names to the memorials that everyone thought would be the last major war that we would fight. I'm going to come back to those utilitarian memorials because you may suggest that there's a contradiction in what I'm saying, right? I said that we didn't build memorials, and now I'm saying, well, we built utilitarian ones. But they're a very different type of memorial, and they shape the way that the memory emerges around the war. And yet when the veterans came back, they too were a part of this discussion. And they agreed to the poppy. It was a powerful symbol that had long been established by the Canadian Legion, and they agreed to Remembrance Day. Although I talk about in the book a really interesting debate where there's a discussion if Remembrance Day should move from November 11th, perhaps to the 6th of June, or the 8th of May, or the 15th of August. Those dates should resonate with you. You should know what they are. But they also speak to the diffuse nature of Canada's commitment in the Second World War. If you were to move the date, what would you mark? Victory in Europe, or victory in Japan, or D-Day, or some other crucial event, the 10th of September when Canada declared war? And so, of course, there was no easy date to choose, and this is discussed by veterans at the time, and so they agreed to keep November 11th. And it's a really interesting part in the book, and I encourage you to read about it if you find that of interest. What veterans wanted, and this too is a really new story, is that the National Memorial in Ottawa, known as the Response, and you can see that here, which was unveiled, as you know, probably in May of 1939, the Second World War veterans wanted their separate memorial. And there's, again, a fierce debate in Canada led by the Legion saying, we accept Remembrance Day will not change, and the poppy is important, but you must build a new memorial. And the problem was that the Response in Ottawa, still there today, is overtly linked to the Great War. The 22 figures passing through the arch are all wearing in intricate detail Great War uniforms. And the veterans of the Second War said, we don't see ourselves here. We need our own memorial. And I talk about this debate. The government of the day by Mackenzie King ultimately refused the veterans to build the memorial. It's a sad story, and it made me angry, and I felt that it's a missed opportunity, and I talk about this in the book. Instead, Mackenzie King said that Ottawa, the nation's capital, would become the war memorial to the Second World War fallen. The beautification program, as it was called, the idea of cleaning up Ottawa, and you can see a model there, was to be the Second World War memorial. Now that's very strange. I've lived in Ottawa 46 out of my 48 years, and I knew that the beautification program came out of the war, but that it was to be the Second World War memorial has been completely forgotten to this day. And it really found very little traction. And I talk about this in the book, how veterans said, that just doesn't make any sense. We don't live in Ottawa. Why would creating bike paths and green spaces be a memorial to the fallen of the Second World War? And of course, it's because it followed that utilitarian principle, the idea of creating memorials that were functional. But too often, and this was identified by veterans both in the 1940s and then again in the 1950s, when they again returned to the government of the day and said, we need our Second World War memorial. Too often these memorials were built, as the Edmonton Journal commented caustically, to solve the war memorial problem, they said, by giving that name to some utilitarian project that was always meant to be built. So you need to build a hockey arena, you call it a memorial arena. And that solves your memorial problem. And veterans identified that. Again, it's important to note that this is rarely what Canadians wanted, and many veterans as well. But they warned that by building a library or a pool was not a memorial site. It was not reverential. It was not a sacred place. It was not a place to bear witness to the fallen, and it never was. It always remained those Great War memorials with the names that were added from the Second World War. And so the Great War continued to dominate the necessary war. And of course, if you add that to the idea that we were moving forward with babies born, with veterans returning to their society, with a prosperous Canada, and if you add to that the fact that we didn't tell our story, you can see how very quickly we forgot about our contributions in the Great War. And I think it continued on, even 10 years after the end of the war. Charles Lynch, a celebrated wartime journalist and a post-war columnist who did write about the war, he returned to Vimy, and he was shocked to find that there was nothing there. He had visited Beaumont-Hamel, he visited Vimy. These were proud sites for Canada, even though they too were little visited in the 50s and 60s until the 50th anniversary of the Second War. But there was nothing to mark the Canadian service and sacrifice at Juno Beach. As he wrote, today, when he visited Juno, there is nothing to show that Canadians and Germans had fought and died on the beach apart from 4 ruined concrete pillboxes. And he wondered, why had the government not stepped up to build a memorial there? Why had the government of the day and every day failed to tell Europeans about Canada's contribution in liberating their continent? He was shocked. And I too have been visiting our battlefields in Europe since the early 1990s, and were shocked that so many of them were never marked with memorials or plaques. And that has changed recently, and that too is a part of the book. And yet, if you do not tell your stories, if you do not build your memorials, if you do not care about your history, don't be surprised that the next generation will not know it. And indeed, the next generation did not know about the Second World War. And a part of that was the Cold War that emerged where, very strangely, our enemies, West Germany, you remember it was partitioned, became our allies again in NATO. And I talk about this through the Kurt Meyer trial in the book. And it's one of the most interesting chapters, I think, where I look at Kurt Meyer. You'll remember he was commander of the 12th SS, who oversaw the murder and execution of 156 Canadian soldiers in the first week in Normandy. He was tried, sentenced to death, and then his sentence was very strangely commuted, and he spent time in Dorchester Prison in New Brunswick, and ultimately freed when the West Germans began to exert pressure on the Allies. His story is a symbol for the way that we turned our back, I argue, on the veterans in the 50s and the 60s. Now, what's really unique and unique about the book, I think, is that I do talk about what veterans were doing in the 50s and 60s through the Canadian Legion and the Royal Canadian Legion as it came to be known, how they contributed to the good in society, and how they understood that their history was being forgotten. And this, no one has ever written about this before, and it's really quite important. And of course, when we did think about our military history from the 60s and onwards, we thought about it in terms of peacekeepers, of which I'm very proud of Canada's peacekeeping nation. But of course, it's not the only thing we've done in terms of our military. It always surprises people when you tell them that our country has been forged in war in the 17th and the 18th centuries, that we struggled to survive against the United States in the 19th century, where we fought 6 wars in the 20th century, when the 21st century has been largely defined by aggressive actions of other nations and the forever wars and Canada's contributions. You simply cannot, if you know anything about our history, boil our military contributions down to peacekeeping, as important as it is. And yet that too cast a shadow over our contributions in the Second World War. We were only too happy to forget that we had put 1.1 million Canadians in uniform, that we had fought to the death against fascism. And of course, the Vietnam War and all that that stirred up contributed to an anti-war feeling, to the point where in 1968, as I write about in the book, the Globe and Mail described Remembrance Day as no longer a day of relevance, but one, and this is a direct quote, of public indifference. Public indifference. Now, many of you will have grown up in the 60s and 70s, and you will remember how few Canadians came out to the memorials. I have uncovered that Remembrance Day was almost canceled. It simply did not resonate in the same way. And we continued to have this self-inflicted wound where we did not tell our stories. And I talk quite a bit in the book about Hollywood films and the impact of these films. The Longest Day, absolutely a crucial film that re-energizes the D-Day story. I write about the Queen's Own Rifles in Toronto at the premiere of the film on the 19th of December, 1962, where the Queen's Own came out and they marched and they were all gathering to watch this film that would talk, they had hoped, about the Canadian contribution on D-Day, of which the Queen's Own, as you know, were one of the spearhead units. And of course, Canada is barely mentioned in that film. In the Great Escape, the story of the Canadians involved in the Great Escape is largely written out of that story. The reviews from the day make note of this, and they talk about how these are great films, and yet where is the Canadian story? What have we done to tell our story? And it continues, of course, to Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers. And when I was teaching at Carleton, people would always say, I love Band of Brothers. What's the Canadian story? Can you point me to that? And I'd say, no, I can't, because the CBC and the NFB have never told those stories. And for the most part, neither have other producers. Now, I'm not naive. It's not easy to make movies in Canada and in a high production Band of Brother-like series. We don't have Steven Spielberg and we don't have that money. And yet we barely tried. We barely tried. And when we finally did tell our story, it was the valor and the horror in the early 1990s. And at that point, and in the book, I talk about the importance of Dieppe in really being a touchstone for thinking about the war, that one day seems somehow, on the 19th of August, 1942, somehow superseded 6 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, the 100,000 Canadians who served in Italy, the Battle of the Scheldt. And yet, when we talked about war, it was about defeat. And that continued to the valor and the horror, which outraged veterans. I won't go into that full story because I want to finish up in the next 5 minutes or so and leave time for questions. They were they were slick films, and yet they focused on defeat. They focused on Hong Kong. They focused on the bombing campaign, which was not a defeat, but yet they portrayed it as an immoral act, of which historians and veterans just simply could not believe that. In the war, in the fight to the finish against Nazi Germany, where Bomber Command played such a crucial role in striking back, in the McKenna Brothers films, it was depicted as a war crime. Absolutely outrageous. And even in D-Day, when the Canadians landed on D-Day and fought and held off the German assaults in the first week and slowly fought their way forward, they didn't choose to talk about the victories or the gritty battles. They chose the one defeat at Verrières Ridge. It was shocking. And this was a series of films that won awards. Veterans reacted violently to it. With one of them, I talk about in the book saying, what kind of people have snatched the torch we hope to pass to young Canadians? And by the 1990s, the early 1990s, if Canadians knew anything about the Second World War, after years of neglect and failing to tell our story, it was of defeat and disgrace. And it was shocking. And then things changed. And they changed at the 50th anniversary. They changed, and it was a surprising change, when thousands of veterans returned to Europe, where the French, and then in the next year, in 1995, the Dutch welcomed back the Canadian liberators. They had not forgotten that we had bled for their freedom. And this time, finally, our networks, our major networks, CBC, NCTV, were there to cover it. In French Canada, there was multi-day coverage as well. And Canadians woke up from their stupor. They woke up from their amnesiac ways to find that 15,000 Canadian veterans were being greeted as the liberators. Some 500,000 Dutch people came out to greet and to show their appreciation to our aged veterans. And I argue that from that point forward, we woke up after decades of indifference. We woke up. We allowed the veterans to break the silence. And finally, Canadians listened. And I continue forward in the rest of the book over the last 25 years where I see there have been improvements. Veterans have talked more about their experiences. We've done a better job in writing about our military history. Young historians have begun to carry our story forward. I focus on George Blackburn and the incredible success of his book, The Guns of Normandy, in giving a voice to other veterans to tell their story. I talk about the importance of the Juno Beach Center, which, as many of you know, opened in 2003 on Juno Beach. The Normandy area was receiving 1 million visitors a year, and yet there was almost nothing there to mark the Canadian experience unless you really were looking for small plaques. And again, as you know, it was veterans who raised the money to create the Juno Beach Center. And where I'm lucky to work at the War Museum, veterans played a crucial role there in raising money for the opening of that museum in May 2005. I'll finish up here with a couple final thoughts. This is the story of 75 years of forgetting, remembering, and remaking Canada's Second World War. You will find many surprises here. I did, and I've studied the World Wars for 25 years. Much of this is unknown history, and I was able to uncover it through archival research, through talking to veterans, hearing their stories, looking at the controversies, looking at the attempts or the failures to memorialize the war. In places, I was very angry. And I think there's still quite a lot of anger in this book. I'm angry at those who tried to diminish the Canadian war effort. And I have a section on British and American historians who denigrated the Canadian Army or the Navy and their contributions. I'm angry at the way that Canadians ignored their history. I'm angry at why the CBC has never attempted a major production to explore Canada's Second World War. Again, we're not the Americans. We don't have Steven Spielberg. We probably can't produce Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan, but we never even tried, save for a few examples. And I think that failure, with many others, to tell our story made me mad. This is the fight. This is the fight for our history. It's also a fight against apathy. And I think, as you'll see in the book, we live in an age now where there's instant outrage, where it's so easy to be distracted in the digital age. And yet history requires taking the long road. It requires the slow contemplation. Outrage is fine, but I think understanding the context is more important, both of the time and the place. And I think, as I found in the fight for history, this fight requires champions. It requires small numbers to expend energy, to work hard, to toil against the apathy, the cultivation and the creation of history. The desire to keep the flame alive is often lonely work. And yet, in the last 25 years, I've seen great improvements with our teachers, in our history books, in our museums, with websites, with social media, in interviewing veterans and creating oral histories. And yet we must continue. We must tell our stories truthfully and bravely. I'm not suggesting that we just produce heroic history. That is the wrong message. This is not hand on your chest, stand behind the flag history. I want us to tell our history, warts and all, the truth, the hard facts, but also not to shy away from the heroic stories of service and sacrifice. And I thank you. I think your attendance here today suggests your interest, that you too are part of the fight. I think it matters to us as individuals, to our communities, to our country. And there's no winning in this fight. But it's a good fight. It's an important fight. It's a necessary fight. We owe it to those Canadians who served in the necessary war more than 75 years ago. We owe it to those who died and who never had a chance to participate and contribute to the modern Canada. We owe it to ourselves to better understand our past that so deeply shaped our country and who we are, and which continues to resonate in the present. And perhaps we owe it to the future, to the young, to those not yet born, who will inherit our complex and contested country, and who should know something meaningful about Canada's staggeringly important contribution in the necessary war. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Tim, for that great talk. I think most of us can empathize with your emotion, with your anger on this. And you're right that it's institutions such as ours at the RCMI, such as the War Museum, the school, and whoever else is, participating today, I'm sure can come up with other examples to fight against this apathy. As you said, this desire to keep the flame alive and, to present a more balanced narrative. And I have found this to be the case as well, in that in this country, I don't know if we're more humble or we seem to deride our own history, that we want to tell the sorry side of history, the defeats, the things we did wrong. It's almost a constant, if you listen to some narratives, it's like Canada never did anything right. We never made any great contributions. But I appreciate, and I think we all do, the audience, this presentation of a more balanced view, and that we need to be cognizant of the many victories and the many contributions that Canada made in the 20th century. So thank you for your lecture.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to turn the proceedings now to the questions, and I will allow participants, as I said at the beginning, there's a chat function in the middle of your webinar platform where you can send the questions through via text. So I've gathered a few questions actually prior to this session, Tim. So I'll ask you those first, as some of our participants are sending their questions through the chat, and I'll get to them in turn. So the first question is from Jim Lutz. He's actually a member of the RCMI Museum Committee, and he is a Vietnam War veteran. Jim's question: Tim, how do you rate the quality of the Canadian official histories compared to the British and American official history sets?
Thanks, Jim. And I've known Jim for a long time, enjoyed his company and his stories, and of course his great desire, I think, to keep history alive, and especially the Queen's Own. Thanks, Jim. I think our official histories are good. I think Charles Stacey's histories have stood the test of time, save for in a couple of places. And one of them that some of you may know was that in trying to sum up the Battle of Normandy and the Canadian advances, which he acknowledged and said were deeper than anyone else's, at least on D-Day, and that the Canadian soldier was as good as any other fighting force, he wondered about the slow advance through Normandy. Now, of course, with the Germans fighting on the defensive and dug in, and with the feared anti-tank 88s and dug in positions and their mortar defenses, it was very difficult to advance. And so he suggested in a paragraph that it was the Canadian junior officers who were not driving their soldiers hard enough. And what's interesting is when I went through Charles Stacey's papers at U of T years ago, he wrote about that passage, and he said he wished he hadn't written that. He felt it was true. Stacey could be a contrarian, but he said it was no different than the British or the Americans, right? I mean, the Germans were very good fighting on the defensive, and ultimately they were defeated. what's interesting about that, though, is that other historians have focused on what Stacey said about the Canadian junior officers and have used that to, again, focus on defeats. And it's always in the Normandy context. And what's really interesting, having talked to my friend Jack Ranestein, is why isn't there the same emphasis on the Scheldt, where the Canadians were fighting through brutal conditions, very much like Passchendaele, often against an enemy who was dug in and almost even odds, and yet who they consistently drove back? Or think of the Rhineland campaign, right? So I think our official histories for the Army are quite good. The problem, as I mentioned just briefly, is that for the Navy and the Air Force, they were canceled. And so we didn't have any way to tell our incredible stories and contributions. Luckily, the Directorate of History and Heritage has been working on those, and they have been published for the Air Force and the Navy now. So I think whatever we say about the histories, as a final thought, the Americans and the British wrote far more and far more detailed, and that goes back, I think, to the telling of the story.
Thank you, Tim. Next question is from Jeremy Hood, who is the assistant curator at the RCMI, and he's also an assistant at the Queen's York Rangers, located at Fort York. Jeremy's question: did you find that there was a similar regimental pride or esprit de corps present in the Canadian units of the Second World War as there was in the First? For example, were raised units expectant or as expectant and wanting to stay together overseas as they were in the First World War?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and good to hear from you. Yeah, there's a fierce regimental pride in both wars, and that shouldn't surprise any of us who have studied military history, or particularly British or American armies. It's absolutely crucial for combat motivation. And one of the things I argue in previous books is to understand how the Canadians fighting in Normandy and beyond that could keep fighting when they were suffering 50, 60, 75% casualties. You have to understand that they were motivated to fight for the man beside them, to continue to go forward, that the junior officers were unbelievably brave in leading from the front, and that's crucial. And the integration of reinforcements could be challenging to break your way into the family, although I don't think that's unique to the Second World War or to the Great War. In the book, I do talk about the conscripts, and I think that's an interesting story, and how we know that the Great War very much was a divisive event because of conscription. The Second World War is not seen in the same way, although I talk about French Canada in the book, and how during the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, some of the activists and intellectuals in Quebec turned back to conscription to use that as a weapon. So the way to weaponize history as part of the sovereignty agenda, culminating, I suppose, in its most violent form during the FLQ crisis. And so that history is a part of this story, and the conscripts play a part in that, but also how the conscripts, for the most part, were almost universally accepted within the infantry regiments when they began to arrive in late 44 and early 45. And yet after the war, they were singled out as not having done their bit in the same way. And so that too is a part of the story that I explore in the Fight for History.
Thank you, Tim. Before I visit the chat and explore the few questions that have been left there, I actually have a question for you. My question for you is, we talked about how many of the soldiers of the Second World War, the Canadian soldiers, didn't write about their own experiences. They didn't produce the memoirs for posterity, and it's very unfortunate. However, are there any memoirs that are on the same level as a Will Bird from the First World War, something that's so well written from the other ranks that it's you would put it on the same plane or the same sort of pedestal?
Yeah, I think the good news is, and I talk about this again in the book, is that I think from the 1980s, we have begun to see more memoirs written by veterans and reflecting on their service. And there's some really terrific ones that I talk about in the book. My personal favorite, and sometimes it comes down to trying to explore a particular battlefield or campaign. I think of George MacDonald in Hong Kong, or I think about Charlie Martin, whose memoir, Battle Diary, I think is one of the best pieces of writing on any experience of war. And to understand the intimate qualities of conflict and loss and grief and of killing and of watching people being killed. And it is a very powerful account. And so I'm pleased that we have seen over the last 15 or 20 years more memoirs. And these are an important way for people to understand that war experience. And we're better for it.
Great. Thank you for that. First question from the chat function. This is from Eric Morse, who is the director of the publications at RCMI, and he'll also be publishing a recorded version of our proceedings today on the RCMI YouTube channel, for those who are interested. So from Eric Morse, Tim, do you get any sense that the failure to remember World War II might be somewhat akin to the Spanish flu collective amnesia, that World War II was lengthier, nastier, and more imminent on the home front than World War I had been? After 1945, people simply wanted to have done. There might have been a rebound by the 60s, but instead we got Cuba, the bomb, and Vietnam.
Yeah, that's what the book is about, and I go into quite a lot of detail on almost all of that. And I think the Spanish flu is a bit of a different story. I've always thought it, and before the pandemic, you can see it in my writing where I have questioned, why did Canadians not build memorials to the flu victims in 1918, 1919? Our best guess is 50,000 Canadians were killed in about a 6-month period. That is a far higher death rate than who died during the course of 4 years of war, spread out over that time period. And yet there was something quite unique about the war that compelled us to erect memorials and to promise never to forget. And we didn't do the same with the flu. And I think you can only conclude that the flu was seen as something akin to a natural disaster, and that Canadians understood death by disease. There's a shocking statistic that Montreal at the turn of the 20th century, that 1 in 4 children died before the age of 1. They died from disease and water infection and failure of malnutrition or proper nutrition. And so Canadians knew death, but there's something about war that's quite different. And there's quite something different about the memorializing aspect of war. And one of the things I pose in this book is, if I look at Vimy and how Vimy, when Walter Allward received the commission in 1922, it was very quickly after the war, even though it took him almost 15 years to complete his incredible monument and memorial. And I wonder, if we had waited 10 years, where would we have been? Well, we would have been in the middle of the Depression years. And I don't believe that there would have been funds or even a desire to build a memorial. So there's something about building memorials and marking service and sacrifice close to the war. And I'm heartened to hear that we are finally building an Afghanistan memorial, which will be in Ottawa, which I hear and read in the newspapers will be unveiled in 2023 or 2024 near the War Museum. And I think that will be an important memorial for us to remember the contributions of Canada in that long war.
Thank you, Tim. And this next question comes from Matthew Domenico. Hi, Tim. Have you come across any animosity between veterans of the European theater and those from the Pacific theater?
Yeah, good question. There were so few in the Pacific theater, of course. We had about 10,000 Canadians who served, about 2,000 in Seaforce, the Hong Kong force and about 8,000 Canadians by best count in various RCAF, RAF units, and then other smaller units, the wireless listening unit. And there were other Canadians who served in various British Army formations. I do have a full chapter in the book on the Hong Kong veterans and their particular fight for recognition, for compensation, and for an official apology. And in fact, I twinned this with the story of Japanese Canadians who were forcibly relocated. And I posed the question of why in Canada do we focus so intensely on the forced relocation of Japanese Canadians, which was an attack on civil liberties, and yet the Hong Kong veterans suffered far, far worse in the Japanese prisoner of war camps, suffered long-term physical and mental wounds that are well documented, and yet the governments of the day ignored them and refused to press their case for proper compensation and an apology. And I don't want to compare the two because they are different, and yet I do talk about, when I talk about Canada focusing on defeat and disgrace, that too is contributing to the story, because as you'll remember, and as I write about in the book, the official apology comes in 1988, and that really shapes the memory of the Second World War. It becomes absolutely prominent, that forced relocation of Japanese Canadians, as awful as it is, and yet there is no equal space for the Hong Kong veterans. So I think, great question, but I see that as the great division. And then I look at other elements. I have a section on the Merchant Navy and the fight for veteranhood for them. And I mentioned the conscripts as well.
Thank you, Tim. Next question I have here from Anna England, who of course is a project manager of Defining Moments Canada and formerly an intern at the War Museum and at the RCMI.
And a co-author.
That's right. Tim, today's society often wants historians to emphasize an apologist attitude. What does this mean for the long term of Canadian military history and commemoration? And the follow-up is, both you and the RCMI Curator are so well versed in the subject. Are there plans to do any collaborative work together?
Right. Well, thanks, Anna. And Anna and I was very lucky to have Anna working with me at the War Museum, where she's an excellent curator, and we co-authored an article on Alfred Munnings, who some of you may know. You can find that in the pages of Canadian Military History, which is online now and digitized. Yeah, we are in a difficult period in our history. It's a period of trying to come to grips, I think, with the past, and largely through the lens of Indigenous reconciliation. That's an important thing that we, as all Canadians, need to do. And yet, it has largely overshadowed almost all other aspects of our history. And I think that if my study of the past through Cleo's Warriors and Vimy and through the Fight for History, and also through my other articles on memory work, is that these things they ebb and they flow. I believe it's important to offer a balanced view of the past. Again, I don't want to whitewash it. I don't want to make it into heroic history. I have spoken to veterans my adult life, and they have said, tell the truth. Talk about the awful nature of war, but also talk about the camaraderie and talk about the companionship and talk about how we at times believed in the cause and were willing to die for it, and at other times could not care in the least as we struggled to survive. And it's so much more than what we often boil it down to. And I believe it's important to tell all of those stories and all of their complexity. I think at the moment we're in a period where those with the loudest voices, perhaps those who engage in activist history, are trying to use history, in some cases, as a weapon to affect change in the present. And We see that with some of the discussion around tearing down memorials and monuments. Some should rightly be removed. And yet, I think by canceling history, most of us who believe in history would say that is not the right way forward. It is not now one new version of history that overlaps and completely smothers the past. We need to find ways to embrace the nuances and the complexities and to move forward together. And so that's an important thing. I think we do need to do a better job in talking about our history, the difficult parts, but also the parts when we came together, like during the Second World War, where English Canadians and French Canadians and New Canadians and Indigenous Canadians and Canadians from across the country and every city, town, village, and almost every class and almost every religion, where we came together to do something hard. And we succeeded. And that too is a story that should be told.
Thank you, Tim. We have just a couple of questions left, so just bear with us. One follow-up from Anne England as well. For me, what do you think the future holds for the military history artifacts in this country if people forget what will happen to the artifacts? That's a great question. And obviously, you know, as a museum curator at the RCMI, this is what I deal in. These are my primary sources, are the objects, are the artifacts. You know, they are these, what I call them, these indelible reminders of history that, you know, the men may be gone, but we still have these objects. And what I say about artifacts and why they're so important, it's easy to see why, you know, archival materials, letters, diaries, etc. I mean, they forge the history, the narrative. But the objects are often a touchstone for those who, you know, have not necessarily entered into this field. They are a way that, you know, individuals can approach the history without having to, you know, read the scholarship, have to acquire the degrees. They come into a museum, they can learn about these objects. I think it sort of, it gathers a wider audience. And just to hit at your question, what does the future hold for them if we forget? Well, museums, like any institution, you know, are run by, they run it on patrons, right? And what we're able to gather in terms of monetary support and grants and these sort of things. So, you know, as Tim emphasized in his speech, we must constantly battle the apathy. We must carry the torches because these institutions need, you know, public support as well to continue. You know, we can have all the great history in the world. We can have all the like-minded, you know, individuals in these institutions, and they get it. We're often preaching to the choir, but we must, you know, continue to promote these narratives with the artifacts, with the primary sources. Otherwise, yes, people do forget. They don't have these sort of touchstones of history. They don't have these institutions to come and actually see, you know, physical reminders that they can, you know, it's one thing to read histories, you know, from a page, but when people see, you know, these things are real, these objects, to me, it sort of has a great impact. And that's what we're trying to defend, I think, from a museum standpoint.
Yeah, I'd agree, Ryan.
Thanks, yeah.
I think that's a very nice defense of material culture and artifacts, and I would agree with you. The only other point, and I think you mentioned it, is, you know, that fight against apathy and that the need to be vigilant, and all of these objects are unique. And I'm always amazed at how fragile some of these objects are 100 years later or more. I'm surprised they're still here with us. And yet they have been cared for, that somebody made the decision to keep the archival letters, or to care for the metal set, or to ensure that the jacket didn't fall away over time through misuse. And it takes work, and we're never going to get more Second World War artifacts. They are out there in our community, in our families. But every day as we lose veterans, and every day as, in fact, their children now, who are often in their mid-70s, as we lose them, there's always the risk that it gets lost and passed down to the next generation. And people, when they talk to me, as I'm sure they talk to you, Ryan, they say, what should I do with my artifacts in whatever they are, and I say, you hold on to them. They're important to you. They matter to you. But if you think that they're ever in danger, you should try to find an archives or a museum or a gallery or a history society, someplace where they will be kept and stored for future generations, because that is the stuff of history.
It's well said. We are always one generation, from losing interest in all of this. And that's what we're constantly trying to avoid. And, as you mentioned with the old Vimy centenary, for instance, 25,000 people, you and I were both there. The majority of people in attendance were students, right? So it's about sort of bringing, I guess, the next generation always into this, not overlooking. It's not just for the scholars and people who already feel strongly about this, but, bringing the next generation into this for, the continuance of it. One more question we have here. This is from Rod Seifert. He's actually a board member of the RCMI. Tim, could you comment on the impact of politics in Canada, particularly post-COVID-19, on your thesis of forgetfulness?
Well, thanks, Rod. It's a good question. Where will we go forward, I guess, is the question. Now, my cop-out is I'm a historian. I'm always more comfortable in looking over my shoulder and looking backwards, but I do think it's important for historians to have a voice in our public discourse and discussion. And as some of you know, I try to do my bit by offering commentary on Remembrance Day or key anniversaries and being in the news when I can. And I think as a whole, historians need to embrace this, that academic historians primarily have done a poor job in the last, a long time, I guess I would say, in not reaching to a broader public. And I think, Ryan, as you were just saying there about those younger generations, we need to reach to them, and we need to take our expertise and to tell our stories. And so that's a kind of broad message that I hope that academics who do tremendous research, but often write in very specialized journals for one another, and not clearly and not narrative driven, and so that much of their specialized research is lost to most Canadians. That's something that should change as we move forward. If we think, I guess, in terms of where we might be on the other side of this pandemic, in terms of, I'll just say, commemoration writ large, I hope that we will be able to return to the gatherings and groups on Remembrance Day and other key events. This is really important. This year, the 75th, would have been a key event to mark the war and to perhaps bear witness to the fewer than 30,000 Second World War veterans who are still alive. This would have been a key event, and we couldn't do that. I hope next year we can, in a 75+1, for instance, and that we do not forget, and that we use that anniversary to remember Canada's incredible contributions. I'll end on a final thought here in telling our story, and I do think that that we need to do a better job in continuing to be vigilant and to reach different generations. And that's probably not, for most Canadians, as it may be sad for me, reading a 500-page Tim Cook book. It may be a different product. The power of a podcast, the ability of a television show or series to reach an audience. Dare one say it, a major film. Are these things possible? If one thinks of the World War II experience in American history, you may be surprised to know that the Americans only built their World War II memorial in 2004, I think the date is. Have we missed that opportunity? We clearly missed it in the 50s and 60s and after the war, as I write about in my book. Is it too late? Is this something that we should do as we are on the knife's edge of losing this generation? I don't have all the answers. I pose quite a few of them in the book, and I hope, and in fact, I know I've received tremendous number of emails from people who have felt inspired by, I think, what I've written in the book, and perhaps a call to action of sorts, and at least the fight against apathy, all of which I think is important in this ongoing fight. And I'll finish there and just thank you again. And I hope you have a chance to read the book, and maybe on the other side of this, to return to that last question, I'll be able to return to the RCMI and we'll be able to speak in person and have a drink and share our stories. And that too is a way for us to make meaningful memories of the past. Thanks very much, everyone.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.